want to orchestrate a jarring transition, make you laugh a little bit, just because you guys seem like you need it, and then plunge you back into despair very quickly. So bear with me, this is going to hurt. Next week is Easter. So if you happen to be here for Palm Sunday, I'm sorry about that. We're not really doing any Palm Sunday stuff. We're finishing a series tonight that ends with Goodbye. And so I decided that actually, in addition to Palm Sunday, this is going to, from here on out, become the feast day of St. Felicia, the patron saint of farewells. And all of God's people said, "Bye, Felicia." But seriously, in the words of Ron Swanson, I'm not usually one for speeches, so goodbye. So there you go. Loosen up. It's going to be okay. You're all dead. Last year, in a lot of what led to us wanting to reflect on this during the season of Lent, I got to serve as a hospice chaplain, and Mr. Kaminsky was the first death that I ever attended. So I saw him take his last breath. This was like a half a mile up the road on Garfield, actually right across from the Watts' house. And this is like 6 days into my first field certified rotation. I felt utterly unprepared. The nurse called me, I was on call, and said, "Mr. Kaminsky is actively dying." And I was like, "Shit, call somebody." And I realized she had. I was like, right. And my thought was like, call an ambulance, call a doctor, but no, they're not going to do CPR. They're not going to resuscitate him. Like, my thought is call like the person who can fix it. And I realized that they had called someone and that it wasn't my job to fix it. And so I got there and I listened as long as he could talk. And then I talked to him and I played his guitar for him, this beautiful classical guitar. And I said, "Your mom is on her way, and she loves you, and she says, don't wait. If you're ready to go, you can go." And he got really quiet for a long time, and then he took these big sort of heaving breaths, very typical. Get really quiet for a long time, and about an hour and a half in, he exhaled, and he died. Goodbye. Mr. Kaminsky, rest in peace. We're completing this Lenten series tonight, Dying to Live. Another huge thanks to Baylor Watts for designing that graphic. Show of hands, if we did a limited run of Dying to Live shirts with a collective logo on them, how many folks would grab one of those? Cool. Someone take a photo. We'll send you all a bill. We may get on that. That's pretty special. Says a lot about who we are, I think, as a congregation. So we're wrapping up this season, this idea of facing death as a means of deepening life, that there is a gift in a terminal diagnosis. And, Pete Rollins says, if I could touch your forehead and make you live forever but not allow you to experience the depth of life, I would be a devil, not an angel. So we'll begin by saying this: repent of your aspirations for everlasting life. Hear and believe the good news. You will die. This is the season of Lent. And we've been engaging this not as a program to apply when death is imminent, but instead as a form of living most vitally alive, fully aware that death is always imminent. We've been learning that the things that make for a good death are the same things that make for a really great life. Will you forgive me? I forgive you. Thank you. I love you. Goodbye. As a hospice chaplain, we coach the grieving and dying through this process of forgiveness, gratitude, love, and surrender. And we worked through these each of the last 5 weeks here, leaving tonight to say goodbye. And while each of these in the context of death has an awareness that it's bumping up against some sort of ending, for some reason, goodbye has a feeling of ultimacy to it. This sort of sharp boundary that makes it seem more formally final. But I think very often, because of the finality, the sense that we get of what's at stake, we resist this departure. We resist the surrender, almost like we can part with strings attached if we avoid saying the words goodbye. And so we play the game. It's not goodbye, it's see you later, right? Yeah, Vin Diesel. This is what I like to call this, like, I feel like it's in all the Fast and Furious movies. Maybe that's just because I shouldn't be watching those movies. I call this the Peter Pan delusion. Peter Pan says, never say goodbye, because saying goodbye means going away, and going away means forgetting. We have this resistance, even to saying it, because we have this sense of what it means. And very often, this instinct means we don't get to say goodbye, or we end up saying goodbye on accident rather than on purpose. John Green says, I do not say goodbye. I believe that's one of the bullshittiest words ever invented. Also, awesome word, bullshittiest. It's not like you're given the choice to say bad bye or awful bye or couldn't care less about you bye. Every time you leave, it's supposed to be a good one. And this quote is a bit contradictory, right? He says, it's not like you're given a choice, but then he says every time you leave, it's supposed to be a good one. And I think the contradiction is that he's actually critiquing this tension that we don't keep the choice conscious. We take goodbye for granted. We hold it at arm's length in order to protect ourselves from the trauma of separation, the trauma of departure. We don't flash the terminal diagnosis in our minds every time we leave, but in reality, we do have a choice. That's what he means by it's supposed to be a good one. We can say goodbye on purpose. We can choose to be conscious of the way we leave. And no surprise here, this should be appropriately redundant after 6 weeks. Living and dying on purpose begins with an eyes wide open awareness of mortality, that the things we need to say and the work that we need to do, the time we have to do it is limited. That's what so many of you said during the discussion. And I love the way that death in tonight's passage is really subtly named just by referring a couple times to people as mortals. God gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one, God made all nations to inhabit the whole earth and allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps in their reaching might find God. Though indeed God is not far from each one of us, for in God we live and move and have our being. So life and breath are given to mortals and maybe also taken away. God somehow names both time and boundary and life and existence, so a sense of finality and something limited. And then I love that it says essentially the thesis of this whole series, that the gift of mortality, of impermanence, finite and conditional as we are, complete with the promise of death, the gift is that we might search for God, the infinite, the absolute, the unconditional, for a God-conscious life of sacred integrity, what's named here as the ground of being, seems to be in this passage. And here's the kicker. It's not far from each one of us. It's already here. We already have it. And so we might amend this punctuated poetic line as in God we live and die. In God we live and die. We move and have our being. So whatever God is, however you conceive of God, here God is in relationship to mortals, or we might say to mortality, to human existence and experience, which include death. In God we live and move. In God we take our first breath and we say goodbye. In the name God is the opportunity to search for and find a life that is already ours, but we won't live it or find it on accident. There is some sense in which we have to search. We have to reach. We have to practice things like forgiveness, gratitude, love, and surrender, not because they promise us God, not because they save us from death, but because they can actually save us from a life that is less worth living. They don't promise us God or save us from death, but they save us from a life less worth living. We could say they prepare us to die well by living well. They open us to a God found in the fullness of life among mortals, life in the boundaries of finite time and limited existence. And this isn't such a stretch, I think, because of the sort of like the idea of the romantic vision of life in God. It's a generous enough image that whatever you think about God, we can bend our hang-ups into cooperation with the vision of life in God. In God we live and move and have our being. That's sort of big enough. But what about in God we die? God in relationship to life is easy, but what about death? What about goodbye? How does that work? And I think it actually works in the same way. If we take the Christian tradition seriously, we inherit a view of God in humanity, God in mortals. In the tradition, this is called incarnation, God in people, the humanity of God. And so in the same way that we meet God in life through people, we experience God in death through people. In fact, the original incarnation in the creation stories, we hear that people bear the image of God. The story is that God breathes the divine breath into dust, animating human life, meaning we get to see God in each mortal other. And then almost in no time, the story introduces death in the same dust as life, but to which we will each in turn return. We see God in each other, and we die. We see God in each other until one day when we don't see God in each other anymore because we're dead. And in death, we can no longer see God in that other. The image of God in the other is extinguished. And so in the same way we experience the life of God in life, we experience the death of God in death. We lose the image of God that we saw and knew in the other, in that person. And the reason death, this goodbye, is so heavy, the reason it feels so final and foreboding is because we actually do encounter the divine in the people we love. We see God, we touch the absolute, we hear from the infinite, we taste the unconditional in human relationships. When we give ourselves to another in love and ultimate concern, we sink into an experience of the ground of being. And when those lights flicker out, we don't only lose the finite. We don't just lose the person, we lose the icon. We lose the incarnate God in that person. There's a car show or something, I'm sure. We lose a particular image of the infinite that we saw, that we knew in a person. And I think of this in light of the creation stories. First, there's God and a person. That's how the creation stories start, right? Well, first there's God. God makes a person. And God says it's not good because the person is alone. Apparently, God is not enough. The first non-good in the creation stories is loneliness. And it's not a loneliness for a transcendent God, and it's not a loneliness for a mystical experience of God. The person already has that, and even God knows that's not enough. That is insufficient. But it's a loneliness for the presence of God in the dust of another person. It's not good because God is most fully known in the dust of another human life. The first non-good, the first existential crisis is loneliness. And this poetic story from thousands of years ago begins to make a hell of a lot of sense. Goodbye is threatening because it speaks to us of a return to a primal loneliness, to this existential non-good. Not that we lose God entirely, not that we even lose that person entirely, but we lose God in this intimate materiality. The image of God, the way that we've known or understood God in the life of the one we love. We experience not only the death of the person we love, but the death of God, the death of our experience of the absolute in a body that we can hold and see and touch, hug, and kiss. In fact, goodbye and death and God, they're all even more entangled. The word goodbye originally comes from the phrase, God be with ye, that Old English. Yeah. It's eventually got shortened to goodbye, thank God. The thought in more traditional religious theistic time periods was that when you're saying goodbye, what you're actually saying is God be with you, or I entrust you to the care of God until I see you again. And whatever you believe about God and death and the afterlife, that's fine. But think about what this does to our practice of surrender. Leaving a terminally ill loved one and saying, I entrust you to God's care until I come back in the morning. I'm going to run out and fill your prescription. Goodbye. God be with you until I get back from the drugstore. What we're saying is, as I leave you, each time I leave you, I surrender this inherited, implicit, instinctual responsibility. I feel I have to keep you alive or to be there when you die. I'm naming for you and me that I release that. I have to walk out the door, but before I do, I need you to know, and I need to be reminded that I release that. I entrust you to the care of the universe, to the care of the ground of being, the source from which you came and to which you will return, however you want to phrase it. Because ultimately there will come a moment where as much as I want to keep you breathing, as much as I want to keep your heart beating, as much as I want to keep your lungs filling with air, I will no longer be able. Not that I've ever really been anyway. But by practicing this non-attachment regularly, it makes this inevitable departure much less jarring. We can practice this surrender. And this is not just like the typical generic surrender the outcome, like I'll just leave myself open to whatever eventuality might come about. That's good. Like we should surrender the outcome like that. That'll help us. But here, it's surrendering to the outcome we know is coming. It's surrendering to the eventuality that death will visit each of us, each of our loved ones. That's a deeper kind of surrendering the outcome. And so we're verbalizing our surrender of control. We can choose to practice surrender so that we're not surprised by it in grief. And we'll still grieve, absolutely. But we can practice this so that we're not surprised by it. And by entrusting our loved ones to the care of God or a ground of being greater and beyond ourselves, the Spirit in whom all that is, when we actually can say goodbye, God be with you, I entrust you to the care of a source beyond myself, I release you from my care and responsibility into the inevitability of your death. And even if you don't do the God thing, if you can't entrust a person to God or the universe, the ground of being, maybe we can trust that one day what is best for you will be to die. Even surrendering to the reality of that sacred rest as what is eventually best for each of us, right? There's a reason people don't live forever. Expiration dates, eventually things fall apart. Eventually, what is best for all of us is that we die. So if you can't get to the God or ground of being thing, at least surrendering to that eventually what is best is that we let go. As dark and morbid and wrenching as it sounds, we can actually learn to be more present rather than less. We can be more intimately engaged precisely because we're not clinging, but holding loosely our role in death so that we can be more fully present in life and in the lives of the people we love. And as a few of you said when we went around in the discussion, people are shocked at how important it is, what a gift it is to tell someone, to release someone when what they most need is to die. And so often, like Dan said, so often the dying are hanging on to some unspoken sense of responsibility or obligation to the living. And the simplest gift of permission that they can die, they can go, that can liberate them to cease fighting, to end their suffering, to find their peace. Love liberates. Love liberates. And just saying it's okay. It's okay, you don't have to fight anymore. You can go. You don't have to live like this. It's okay. Your work here is done. So practicing this, saying goodbye, includes some awareness that incarnation, the humanity of God or material spirituality, for us involves some experience of the death of God in the death of our loved ones. That's why it hurts so much. That's where we see and feel and experience the absolute, the unconditional in love with those people. And then whatever it means for us to entrust the care of our loved ones to a source or a ground or a care beyond our own, we can do this in healthy ways by practicing surrender rather than clinging in fear and control and guilt. We can practice that. Ilia Delio is a phenomenal philosopher, theologian. She brings these ideas together beautifully in her notion of what she calls the cosmic Christ, which I think ties together our approach to the Eucharist, as well as the gravity of Good Friday. This is the icon of the death of God. Come celebrate with us, Friday at 6. And she plants seeds also here of resurrection. I want us to be really careful that we don't rush through the imminence of death. This is Holy Week. It's supposed to feel like this. Settle in. She says, without the cosmic notion of Christ, Christians can't understand that God is inherent in life itself, that God is the life force of everything, who grows things from the inside. The indwelling Spirit was our way of saying that God creates things that create themselves from within. In humans and animals, this is experienced as sexuality. In plants, as photosynthesis. Elements participate in the creative process through electromagnetic fields, fusion, and bonding. Even celestial bodies experience death and birth. There is only and always growth. Death is simply a transformative stage. She goes on immediately to quote this passage. Indeed, God is not far from any one of us, for in God we live and move and have our very being. And she concludes by saying, if this is true, then it has to be true everywhere and all the time. If we're going to say that goodbye punctuates this work, will you forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, I love you, goodbye. If it's the punctuation at the end of this process, of this form of life, it might be that this punctuation is an ellipses and not a period. Because not only is there a little bit of death in every step, will you forgive me? The death of my pride in asking. I forgive you. The death of what I've been holding on to, unwilling to release it. Thank you. The death of keeping my joy to myself and refusing to share it and instead letting it overflow in expression. Giving it away. I love you. The many deaths of vulnerability required to show up as ourselves in our own lives. And goodbye. The death of surrender, which liberates our loved ones and frees us to be fully present in life rather than paralyzed by the fear of death. So not only is it a process, a transformative stage, but it's a transition. It's not a period, but an experience, even a practice of death that makes a way for the most full and unconditional life, the kind of life that can mysteriously transcend and include even death. And this is what we encounter in the Eucharist each week, an invitation to reflect upon this reality, death as the engine of life, something that can actually amplify life, as well as an invitation to practice, not just to think about an idea, but to practice this form of life. Death as an ellipses rather than a period. Jesus says crazy things like, if anybody wants to follow me, they've got to take up their cross, right? Like this image of death. He says if anyone wants to save their lives, they're going to lose it. But if they lose their lives, ellipses, not period, then they'll find it. Jesus doesn't proclaim a reality where death is overcome by believing the right things, but instead a reality in which death is faced. It's named head on. Not only in the literal, final, biological certainty, but the thousands of tiny deaths that we get to choose to participate in and practice as we choose to form ourselves in the way of death as the path to a full life. And when Jesus invites his followers to remember, it's not the memory of a single moment in which he undoes the gift of mortality. It's funny that this has become so popular in Christianity, as if Jesus at this table goes, oh, never mind, just kidding. Disregard all my teachings. Just believe in me and live forever and forget about all the mortality stuff. Rather, this becomes the climactic moment where he reminds them to remember the form of life that he showed them, the depth of the life they had experienced with him, and the way that they could practice that together. As often as they eat and drink, they could have life because they could remember the promise, the gift of mortality, body separated from blood, a bouquet of death which sings in the harmony of horror and hope of the path to life. As he prepares to die, to say goodbye, he says, remember me. Remember me. Remember what I was willing to die for. Remember the way that I lived. And in that, we might hear an echo from the last 6 weeks. Remember the things that make for a really good death, which, by the way, we're still talking about it. It's been a couple thousand years, so apparently he did death well. The things that make for a really good death make for a really good life. This is the table set for us each week, a table which speaks honestly of life and death, speaks of life and death in God, dust to dust. It speaks to us of the life and death of God, the humanity of God that we experience even in death. And it speaks to us of the fullness of God as the ground of being, as the Spirit in whom we all live and die. This table has been set for us tonight. It is open to us and to all people. And no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.